Talk of the Bay, KSQD's local talk program brought to you every weekday at 5 p.m. On Indigenous Peoples Day, what better subject to discuss than how borders and technology affect the people who are enclosed, separated, and surveilled. I'm your host, Suki Wessling, and today I am joined by UCSC Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Felicity Amaya Schaeffer. Along with discussing the meaning of this holiday, we'll talk about her research into the history of borders and the technology used to enforce them, as well as the mechanized future of border surveillance and enforcement. Welcome, Felicity Amaya Schaeffer.
Thank you.
And listeners, you will be able to listen to a podcast of this. So if you're in your car and you are wondering how, you will be able to go to ksqd.org after the program. So Felicity, this is such it was a bit of a nice little coincidence that I saw an article about you, and this is the date that I had available, because today, as my calendar informed me that it is both Columbus Day and Indigenous Peoples Day. So obviously we're not completely on one side or the other as a country. Can you talk a little bit about this shift that's happening in our culture, that we went from celebrating conquest with Columbus Day to attempting to understand it and rectify its consequences?
Yes. It took a lot of Indigenous activists to really push for this switch. And, actually the celebration of Columbus Day came out of a desire to value Italian Americans who were living in the United States in the 1930s. But most people don't know that history. So it's definitely a good switch that we've moved from Columbus Day to Indigenous Peoples Day. And, it's a good moment to remember whose land we're on. For example, even here in Santa Cruz, we're on the Awaswas Yupi tribe's land that's being stewarded by the Amut tribal band, who were actually brought here against their will to work in slavery-like conditions in the mission system. So if you're looking for things to do to support and not just, say that, yes, it's Indigenous Peoples Day, look up Amut tribal band and see how you can get involved.
Yeah, they've been on there. We've had a couple of programs. So if anyone is interested, you can go to our website and search for, I think if you just search for AMAH, you should come up with some programs. That I know that there's been one on environmentalism in the last year.
You can actually sign up and help them pull out invasive species or replant native species, plants that have longer roots or that are more drought resistant, fire resistant. So you can definitely get involved, you can donate, and you can participate.
Excellent. And also, I know for my kids, although it is at the mission, they have kids stuff at the mission that does teach you how local people lived before the mission system, which I found really, really interesting. And we would make food or learn songs or whatever. So there's a lot of options around here for learning more about who lived here and how people lived before we had what we have now,
right?
A crowded highway and not enough housing,
right?
Yeah. So where do you think we are as well? How about let's start with the community, because obviously our nation is really fractured right now. But as a community, where are we in this movement from the idea of celebrating, considering the start of things to be when Europeans came here, to acknowledging the full and real history?
Yeah, I think we have a long way to go. There's a battle about teaching even ethnic studies and learning Indigenous people's history in the school system. So it's really difficult for us to really have a sense of what it was like, what it's still like for Indigenous people today, right? Not even just to learn about the history, but most people don't realize that Indigenous people still live, in the United States, here in Santa Cruz, all over, and are still fighting to bring their land back. So we have a long way to go. but it's definitely a fight that many of us are invested in.
Yeah, and I've definitely noticed that things have been changing in the last few years of how people use language. How important is the language that we use when speaking about others or speaking about the land or speaking about history?
That's a great point. It's so important. I remember when I was visiting the Tohono O'odham Reservation, and for them, they don't have concepts like borders and walls in their language. So when we speak about things, the words we use, the way we talk about things, the values that we bring are incredibly violent, right? Because there's so much about how we live with the way that we think about things and how we use these terminologies. So, yeah, I mean, we have to learn a very different language.
Yeah, and the way that I think a lot of people don't understand that the way that you speak can actually be violent to other people when it's not to you.
Yeah, that. What do you mean when it's not?
Well, that we people with a Western, a European mindset, borders they just seem obvious.
Right,
In
natural.
fact, yeah.
Like they've always been there. Yeah, no, they definitely have a history, and they have consequences on people's everyday lives in ways that we don't necessarily see.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so how has your own life story led to your interest? I mean, and it's a particularly unusual interest in borders and technology, which I find fascinating.
Right. Well, I've been interested in borders and migration since I was an undergrad. My own family, crossed the border from Mexico at a time when it was a border, but there wasn't much, it wasn't really militarized. There wasn't border patrol there. But when they landed in Texas, they definitely felt the effects of the border as Mexicans living in the United States, and the way that they were treated and the racism in Texas and San Antonio. So it's been an interest of mine too, since in college I read Gloria Anzaldua's Borderlands, and really thought, my family is so influenced by that artificial demarcation on the land. And so the book that I wrote recently, Unsettled Borders, was a project that I thought, was going to really look at how technologies at the borders affected migrants, but it became a very different story. And also, the way that the border has changed since the 90s, it's impossible not to think about technology today when you think about borders, because there's been one law after another that's passed, just amplifying the virtual border.
It's interesting when I was reading your book and thinking about your family history, that so many families, depending on what side of the border their family ended up in, have a completely different cultural association, and a whole, your family would be Native American or Indigenous American if they had been on this side of the border when it was drawn.
Well, that's interesting because, even for my family that stayed in Mexico, the Mexican, the nation state, even the term Mexican is a terminology that came about in the 1920s that was supposed to be this mixture between the Spanish and the indigenous, right? This cosmic race that was called the Mexican, which was really about erasing your indigenous ancestry. So even my family in Mexico they've lost that connection to what it means to be indigenous, even though it's clear we have family that were indigenous. They've lost those knowledge practices. They've lost, that sense of themselves. Mm-hmm. And that's been a state-led project.
Yeah, it's interesting because in Santa Cruz there are some. I did another talk with some linguists who are working with residents of Santa Cruz who are from Mexico, many of whom do not speak Spanish or speak it as a second language. And I think that a lot of Americans don't really have that association with Mexico. We think of Mexicans because that's what we are, the idea we're fed, that there's this monolithic group, but of course there isn't at all.
Right. If you go to Oaxaca, there's, a lot of indigenous languages there, and there's still people who may not speak Spanish. I mean, many of them do, especially if they have contact with people outside their indigenous community.
Mm-hmm. So I was interested in something that I noticed you used a term that I'd love for you to explain a little bit. Denativized Chicana. How would you describe what that means?
Yeah, it's not a terminology that I came up with. There's other scholars who use it, but it's a way of sort of reclaiming this connection that many of us feel to indigenous practices, and a sort of political way of saying, we have a connection to land that we've lost. We have a connection to indigenous practices back in Mexico, that have been lost. And so, many of us, while we don't claim necessarily that we're indigenous because we're not part of a, reservation or a recognized tribe or even an unrecognized tribe in the United States, we definitely see ourselves in political alignment with indigenous peoples, both in across the Americas.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's something that's interesting that I think is becoming clearer to people. I remember many years ago reading an article by someone whose family was I guess they were Mexican when California was Mexico. Their family never moved. And so so they didn't consider themselves Native American, even though they were. So we have such a complex web of identity and geography and politics and borders. So I want to just break here and let listeners know that I am speaking to Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Felicity Amaya Schaeffer. And we are talking about the border here on Indigenous Peoples Day. And so I wanted to move to the history, because you start in your book with the history and you talk about history that I had never, well, obviously, we all take American history, and yes, you out there in Radio Land can hopefully hear my air quotes because American history is, as they say, history is written by the victors. It is whose ever perspective is writing it. And so, I looked at your historical information and I thought, this is nothing like what I've ever read. So I wanted to ask you to describe how you first came upon this history of Indigenous people being used as scouts, and what you learned as you researched it.
Yeah, I mean, this was a history I had never heard either. But as I was digging into, I had this question: how was it that the border has become so militarized? When did this even begin? And I started to follow the technologies, like the drones. When were the drones made? What's the history of the drone? And it took me to Fort Huachuca, where the first border drones were built. This is a fort that's actually still in existence. It's a militarized intelligence fort, and students come and they learn all kinds of technologies on the border and in warfare. And I went there and I found two museums side by side. One was the one was the history of the Indian Scouts Museum, and the other one was about these high-tech drones and other kinds of intelligence, militarized intelligence. And what I realized there is that the story of the border had not been told in terms of this earlier history of the Indian Wars against the Chiricahua Apache and the Sioux and others who, in this, what's now thought of as an Arizona-Mexico border region, had crossed the border. And this is a mountain region, so it's actually very difficult to cross this border region. But they were fleeing from the cavalry army that was trying to put them on reservations. And so it got me thinking about the story of the border. When we tell it from only the perspective of migrants, we've missed this whole history in which these forts were set up after the Civil War to contain and discipline Indigenous peoples. And it was a massacre as well, because it was also, there were a lot of Indigenous peoples that were killed. But, most of the listeners will know the story of Geronimo, who was actually, evaded the army for over 20 years by being able to cross. So, there were these studies, these military intelligence that came out of this fort in the 1860s and 70s, where I realized the army officers were actually engaging in this empirical study of Apache warriors, and they were amazed that they could creep up on their army, and this is where the surprise attack comes from, that they could communicate across long distances and move without being seen or heard. And they were fascinated by this, and this became the whole foundation for military intelligence and the hiring of Apache scouts that could be used, as they were called, the eyes of the army, to actually locate and find some of their own people.
And so these were people who were essentially working for the army against their own people or against other tribes?
Both. And it's complicated because, different tribes, even people within the same tribe, had very different ideas about how they should approach this encroachment of the army. So when Geronimo fled, some people thought that was, part of this resistant culture that they were really proud of. After years and years had gone by, there was so much violence that was enacted against people within their own villages that some people really wanted Geronimo to give up. And so it was complicated, right? And so some people signed up against other tribes and sometimes even within their own tribes.
That's fascinating, and it's also extremely, as you said, complicated, which is perhaps part of why it's so hard to boil it down into a history book for high schoolers. How do you relate to young people the difficulty of choices that people were making?
Well, what I really tried to do was find sources that came not just from the perspective of the military officers who were writing these books about national security, state security, or border control, but to find sources by Apaches themselves who tell the story of Geronimo in a way that allows you to understand that Geronimo, became a warrior. He wasn't born a warrior. He became a warrior because his entire family was massacred in front of him. So, I think there's this stereotype that these Apaches were sort of born violent warriors. But, I try to put the story in this context to which we understand the violence that was launched against them has everything to do with their response.
Yeah, and it seems like people should be able to understand this, but it's like there are two warring parts of the human psyche. One is that we understand protecting our own, but on the other hand, there's this deep, strong, need to other people, and to say that's them, this is us. And then how confusing it gets when we and they are crossing over and having complex interests, like you were saying with the scouts who worked for the Army, feeling that they were also working for the right thing for their people.
And I should say that some of those scouts led the Army in the wrong direction.
Oh, they did.
Yeah, so there's that story too.
Double agents.
Yeah. So, that is part of the complexity. There were so many different reasons and, why they actually would participate in something like that. But, part of it is really breaking down, because you're right. We're talking about borders that are not just geopolitical borders in terms of maps, but we're also talking about borders between, us and them, land versus human, right? All of these ways that we think about difference and separation that in a lot of Indigenous ways of thinking and living are completely alien to them. So part of it is really asking, what is the criteria through which the settlers came onto someone else's land and decided that it was theirs to take? And that is a story that, it had to be justified. And technology is one of those ways in which the project of civilization was launched, right? There's no, buildings here. So there was no people claiming the land, or they couldn't see their ways of planting as sophisticated enough, right? So that they thought it was just wild land, right? It's their ways of seeing land and presence and absence of people. And then even when they would find people, they would think, oh, they have no technology, they have no intelligence. They must be barbarians or primitive people that need us to help them. Right? We have to unpack how these ideas get formed in order to unpack them.
Yeah, definitely. And so when you're talking about the historical portion of your research, I thought it was really interesting that you, in a sense, define these skills that Indigenous people had developed as technology, even though it wasn't physical. So you talk about the contrast between binoculars and their way of seeing distance and seeing what's on the horizon. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so part of the book, I really was passionate about unpacking Indigenous relations with land as a science, and I call it a sacred science. Because again, in this context in which they were called primitive people, I thought it was so important to talk about how deep these knowledge systems were, that they could see things that the Calvary just were completely ignorant of. They knew the land so intimately. They knew, where the sun was at a particular time of day, where the shade was, where you could hide from an entire, army of people just by hiding in a crack by a rock where the shade is at a certain time of day. They knew where the location of water was, so they could travel long distance as long as they were following certain water routes. So, all of that knowledge was passed down generation after generation and comes from this real study and this real love of the place that they live. And to me, that was a form of belonging that gave them an upper hand, that the Army knew they had to break that relationship to land if they were going to conquer these people.
And so how did they do that?
Well, there's guns. There's a lot of settlers coming into this area. And they were just completely outnumbered, over time. And so, People were taken off of they were killed. They were also taken off of their land, put onto reservations. There was a whole policing around reservations so that people couldn't leave. And they would put them on land where there wasn't as much food sources or water. So in all of these ways, this act of bordering and controlling this land was really a genocide. And it continues today at the borders.
Yeah, so they you said they knew that they had to break this connection. Sticking with history, because we'll get to the present day soon. Mm-hmm. What did they do to try to break these connections?
Well, when you remove people from a land where you know all the plants, the medicines, where the animals are, where the water source is, where it's good to plant. If you remove them from all of that deep knowledge that they have and pluck them out and put them somewhere else, you're destroying a whole people's way of connecting to the land, to each other, to their practices and rituals, to that responsibility that they have to take care of that land.
Yeah, you were saying that since it was all oral tradition, that there wasn't a manual. It's if you break that line, then it's broken, and the knowledge is broken.
And the knowledge is in the land, right? So it's written, or there's also art, there's stories that are all tied to that land. Mm-hmm. So when you pull people away, you're breaking all of their connections in that knowledge system.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know the numbers, but from what I've read, it seems that a large number of the reservations that Native people live on today are not their ancestral land.
Right. They're a much smaller size compared to the land base that they used to be on.
And also sometimes in whole different places.
Yes,
they were
whole different states.
Moved.
Right.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And you mentioned that here in Santa Cruz, that's the situation.
Right. You have, some people whose families have been on this land for a long time. And then you have like the Amat Mutsun. They were forced here. But the beautiful thing that they're doing to learn about the plants in this region, to try to pick up on the knowledges that were here and to carry on, that role is really beautiful.
I am speaking with Professor of Feminist Studies and Critical Race and Ethnic Studies, Felicity Amaya Schaeffer. And we're talking about the border. We're talking about the experience of Indigenous people who are split by borders. We've talked in the last half an hour about the history of how our Army interacted with Indigenous people at the border. So this half hour, we are going to move on to perhaps some more recent things. And Felicity, the first question, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about how you came across the Tana Atum Nation. And maybe
Tohono O'odham.
Tohono O'odham. Okay, I looked it up and I still didn't I wrote myself a little. Okay, Tohono O'odham Nation. How you came across them and got interested in learning from them?
I had been, hearing about the occupation of the Department of Homeland Security on their land, and was just amazed at what was happening and that there was so little being said about it. And so this project was sort of forming, and, I just felt really passionate that this part of the story had to be talked about. And about the same time, one of my students had introduced me to some of her O'odham friends who actually came to my house to have dinner. And we started talking about the border and the project that I was working on. And, after a very heated conversation over dinner, they invited me to come to their land because they really wanted me to see the effects of the border on their land. So I happily accepted their offer.
Can you describe what it's like where they live?
So they have their reservation is in probably from Tucson south, and it goes across the border. And when I was there, we had just had these just torrential rains. So, I just had to throw everything out in terms of how I understood the desert region. The desert was in bloom so beautifully, wildflowers everywhere. And, it's a land where you don't see a lot of buildings. There's a very few roads, and it's incredibly quiet. So the soundscape, because it's completely covered by mountains, so the echoing sound of things is just so different than what we're used to in more cities. A beautiful, beautiful land and beautiful people.
And how would you describe their current lifestyle? Are they living in a mixture of ways, modern and traditional, or how are they living and interacting with the land?
Well, yeah, I mean, they've been again occupied by Department of Homeland Security. There's Border Patrol all over the land. The water source, the water table under their land has been siphoned for years, and a lot of their water has been pulled into Tucson and other cities. So agriculture's been very difficult. There's been mining, there's an observatory tower, there's been one incursion after another. So it's difficult to practice your traditions when your parents might have been taken from you and, been in boarding school. So you weren't raised by your parents. And so a lot, they're always there, the elders are continuing the traditions. It's hard to keep the young people to follow the traditions all the time, because, when you have to go to the market or you go to school, elsewhere, or you have to work outside the reservation, it makes it difficult to live by some of these traditions. But yeah, it's a mixture.
Yeah. What are some, you mentioned a sort of list of things, and the one thing that I think most people don't think of when they think of a reservation is Border Patrol being allowed to do pretty much whatever they want there, it sounds like.
Yeah, I mean, it's really violent to have a detention center on your land, to have, when I was there, I just saw Border Patrol vehicles all over the place. They tried, when we were there, they tried to come and give candy and toys to the kids. So they're clearly trying to remake their image there. But the Otham are getting caught up in checkpoints that are meant for migrants, and the Border Patrol will demand that they show documents that they're allowed to be on their land, right? On their own land. Mm-hmm. So it's a question of sovereignty for them and autonomy. They don't want to carry U.S. documents. They're not a citizen of the U.S. nation, right? They are on their land. Mm-hmm. Some of the, the drug runners. So, let me give a little bit of context for what's happened. In the 90s, we had immigration policies that closed certain borders with walls and Border Patrol. And then you have this whole 62-mile, sort of as the crow flies across the Otham border region that was completely open. It maybe had a vehicle barrier in the early 2000s. But so basically, by closing all of the borders next to their land, they funneled migrants into this very hot desert region during certain times of the year. And so this is where you have a lot of the drug runners coming through. You have migrants coming through, many of them who have died on their land. So you can imagine the kind of trauma of, living with all of these people who, many of them are unidentified. So the trauma of the Border Patrol has just landed on their reservation and affected all of them in one way or the other.
And I think that you referred to in your book that they can't even help these people, because if you help someone who's illegally crossing the border, you become an accessory. So if they gave them shelter,
right,
they can't give them shelter. They
can't even give them water or food, which, as you can imagine, it's just so inhumane. It's a very difficult situation, and it has really fractured a whole community of people, because, some people who have homes by the border have their homes broken into. Other people have kids that, have gotten entangled in the drug trade, and they're getting sent to detentions and prisons off the reservation. They don't have jurisdictional authority to handle drug runners on their own. So that's also something that's very difficult for them. As all of this traffic is funneled through their land, they only have jurisdiction over Otham. So that has really meant, it's made it impossible not to have Border Patrol there in many ways because of the situation that they're put in.
Yeah, and you could imagine the Border Patrol or the U.S. government saying, "You need us. Look at this." But that, as we've been talking about, the placing of borders in places that didn't have borders, you create these unintentional consequences by putting them there. So,
right, and funneling them into a desert region where many of them are still being killed is also a sort of negligence by design, and a kind of, killing of migrants, that they can sort of say, we didn't do it, we didn't shoot them with a gun, but the environment themselves is a place where migrants aren't used to, right? They don't know the land like the Otham do. So, it really led me to think about a border not just as a wall or an area or a region, but as a practice, a colonial practice that is about containment. And so migrants and Otham are both being contained, whether it's, surveillance cameras, detentions, prisons, or being occupied and contained on your own land. The other really difficult thing about having this border is that, again, for people who had family on both sides of the border, it's cut them off from their relatives. It's cut them off from ceremony and these practices and, keeping up with relations, both people and land on both sides of the border, which is, again, everything that has to do with preserving who they are as a people, that, again, is being destroyed. And I think it's so important to understand these, the treatment of Indigenous people, not just in the past, but the ongoingness of this colonial border project.
Yeah, and you can think about someone who is Otham in Mexico becomes a criminal,
right,
if they cross onto a different part of their land,
right,
which is, you think about that and think that makes no sense at all, but our borders have created this sort of nonsensical situation for them.
Right.
And the Otham on the Mexican side, are they largely, do they still think of themselves as a distinct group, or are they more assimilated into Mexican culture?
Well, the Otham still say that's their land. Unfortunately, so many people have moved to the U.S. side because that's where the hospitals are. That's where more of the resources are. Their families, they want to be united with their families. So I think there's only, maybe a little over 2,000 of the Otham on the Mexican side of the border.
Wow. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And that you talked about also the actual technology that's being used against them, and I want to get to that because I think it's so interesting. It's not, you started your book talking about the binoculars, and the binoculars, of course, giving human eyes the ability to see further. And in a sense, a lot of the technologies that are being used now also do something similar in a much more high-tech way. But before we talk about that, I'm going to let listeners know that this is KSQD Santa Cruz, and you are listening to Professor Felicity Amaya Schaeffer talking about the border and her research on border and technology. So let's talk about that technology. What other types of technology are they currently using on the Otham land in Arizona?
Right. Well, two things. One is that they've put these surveillance towers on their land. So the infrastructural violence is something that I would not have understood without being there and talking to people about what that means. I mean, even building a road on their land, you can see it. I mean, just there's no fences on land like you see here. The animals crossing, you can see that, the wildflowers just interrupted by a road. So what that even does, but these surveillance towers can see miles and miles from their location. They can see into cars. They can even see into houses.
How do they do that?
The technology, the infrared technology to see, allows them to see through walls. So what kind of autonomy do you have when everything you do is being watched? How does that shape your every movement? Some of the, young men that we were running with told us how they used to, not even think twice about walking around or running in the evening when it was cool. And now they're afraid, right? There's the surveillance towers, there's border patrol, there's people that are crossing, it's violent all around them. And then, President Trump started building his 30-foot steel wall on the Oregon Pipe National Monument, which used to be and is still considered Otham land, and they still try to keep up their stewardship of this land, even though it's been difficult now that the Border Patrol, some of the actual rangers on Oregon Pipe are also Border Patrol. And so you can imagine, that they've had a fence up on the Otham Reservation. Now they have a vehicle fence. So sometimes you have to drive, for hours just to get around to be able to cross the border. So all of the, and Border Patrol, right? This is bringing all of these foreign people with very different ideas onto your land. Again, the migrants who are crossing desperate for water or food or desperate, to get out of these situations in which are killing them.
Mm-hmm. And that of course is why humans have always moved for a variety of reasons, but one of the most important and urgent has been for personal safety.
Well, I mean, for the Otham, moving, they've always moved because the land changes depending on what season it is. Sometimes, you've got to follow where the water flows. You have to follow where the animals go. So this idea that you would just stay in one place is a very strange concept to them. So putting a wall on their land where they used to flow and cross at ease, or even, sending prayers up to the sky, and now you see drones or you have the static from a surveillance tower. I mean, these are things that, in the West, people can't even imagine how violent that is. But, even the buzzing sound of those towers is so disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's interesting because when you were talking, I had this memory. I remember the first time I ever saw someone on a street with an automatic weapon. And that was in South America. And it really struck me because I had grown up and lived, 20 plus years at that point in the United States, and I had never seen someone walking around with an automatic weapon. And I thought at that time, that's a freedom that we have here. It's not necessarily a freedom that we have anymore, given the proliferation of guns and also what's happened at the border, which is so different than it used to be.
Right. Yeah. Absolutely.
So with that happy, but I guess I want to know what, obviously the wall was so problematic in so many ways, and and obviously it's not the solution. It's not the solution for nature. One of the things you show in the book is a beautiful ancient cactus that has been cut down for the wall.
Right. So I talk about the wall itself as a technology that enacts incredible violence. So when Trump's border wall was put up, they had to siphon water for the concrete that came from one of the oldest spring waters, Baquito Springs. This was such an important water source, storied place where people came together and animals would come. And when they would bomb the land to clear it for the wall, they also bombed many of their ancestral burial sites. They also, some of the petroglyphs and sacred sites were also bombed. And, what I really, rather than leaving this as like this devastating story, which it definitely is, I really wanted to also privilege and kind of fill the violence with the incredible ways that Native peoples have with land. And so one of the things I also learned was the special relationship that the Otham have with the saguaro cactus on that land. And so, they don't have borders, but they have a responsibility that they feel very connected to with the saguaros. And, the saguaros are their ancestors, they're their teachers. They teach them how to preserve water, how to hold water in their waxy skin. They teach them about the seasons, the blooming, the different animals that rely on the cactus, using the wood of the cactus to build fences or homes or furniture. And so it's also a story that, tries to really teach, settlers and Westerners about how beautiful their way of life is, and that it's so important, not just for them, but for all of us at a time when we're destroying, the environment and people's lives that have protected this land for so long, that there's so much that we should be in alignment. We really should stand with the Otham people against the border, stand with the migrants against the border. The book was really an incredible opportunity for me to learn more about that relationship with land.
Mm-hmm. If you were asked by some people who had political power about some direct things, I mean, there's what we would hope in the perfect world, and then there's what we could do in this world. What are some initial steps you might suggest for fixing the relationship between the United States, which isn't going anywhere anytime soon, and the Native people that it has set into this situation? What are some things that could be done?
Well, one of the reasons why I wrote this book was because if we don't understand all of what Native peoples have to contribute to this country, we won't understand why we need to learn from them. We've always, in the United States, the idea has always been that we have something to teach Native Americans. And it's completely the opposite. And also, I think they have a very different idea of time. And I don't think there's going to be any quick fix, but we need to get rid of Border Patrol, border technologies. It's unfortunate that even Democrats are behind some of the virtual wall because they think that that's a more humane approach to border control.
Yeah. And how is it? I mean, it's interesting to think about many of us agree that the wall was a bad idea. But then I've heard that this is a more humane thing. But the way that you describe life on the Otham Reservation, maybe it's not so humane.
No, it's definitely not. And it allows for bordering to become a practice that can actually survey and contain people miles and miles from the actual border wall. So, it's an incredibly violent system when we understand it from the peoples whose lives it affects. And I think it does come down to what we were talking about earlier in terms of understanding some of the deep violence that even our ways of thinking about ourselves and others, right? The ways that ideology separates us from people and allows us to not see the violence that we're committing, even just with the ideas that we have about how the world is. And I'm just hopeful that more people will learn and listen to the Native peoples who are, actively at the border, demanding that the Border Patrol leave their land. But it's going to take a massive effort across the entire border. It can't just be localized to the Tohono O'odham Reservation. And it would have to be a completely different way of living that we would have to really listen to the people themselves, all the Native, 40% of the border is Indigenous peoples. So what do they need? What do they want? That's where we have to start.
I think that's a wonderful way of putting it, especially on this day that, as we started our discussion, has shifted from a celebration of conquest to a celebration of understanding and appreciating what everyone has to bring to this world. So, Professor Felicity Amaya Schaeffer, I just wanted to say thank you. Is there anything else that you hope that people will take? You're dedicating your life to this research, but what is something that you hope people will take away from it that any person could find?
Well, I think the way we even think about climate crisis and the environment, again, Indigenous peoples have so much to teach us about that right relation with the land that even sometimes our environmental movement misses.